All right, let's talk about Milton Friedman. I don't have a ton to add to the reading and the podcast episode, but let me just kind of point out a few highlights. And then I've got a little thought, maybe an idea that might be helpful for you guys working on your final projects. So on Friedman, one interesting thing we've seen across the economists that we've seen a sort of a libertarian bent. Now, libertarian is one of those terms that gets very much abused, especially in 2023. I think a nice sort of way of laying this out is The Three Languages of Politics essay by Arnold Kling, which is relatively easy to find. You can find a $0 version of it somewhere. I think libertarianism.org. But the basic idea is when we think about people's different ideologies, there's sort of three big camps. There's really two very big camps, and then libertarianism is a smaller third camp. I'm not going to dig into libertarianism, but I will point out that Friedman definitely, especially in his later work, had a strong ideological motivation behind the scenes. Now, that ideology was certainly in line with the likes of Adam Smith, who was much more small government oriented than the thinkers of his time. You look at certainly Mill, Marshall, Ricardo, a lot of the thinkers. Keynes also, right? The thinkers that we've been looking at are often strongly motivated not just to understand, but also to try to affect the world in a way that they think will make it a better place. Right, so there's kind of this general inclination towards reform. And I think an interesting point that came up in the podcast episode is the contrast between Friedman's goal of trying to make the world a freer place and Gary Becker's view that it's a fool's errand, right? You're not going to do it. The incentives facing policymakers are just too much at odds with good policy. You might as well view it like a circus. It's entertaining to try and understand political incentives, but you're just not going to change people's minds. Friedman really did change a lot of people's minds. He really had a surprisingly large impact on the world. Little clarification. So, in the technical meat of this chapter, a lot of it is about monetary theory. So, a big part of this, the quantity theory of money. This is the equation MV equals PQ or PY. Q if you want to think of the amount of stuff we make, or Y if you want to think about income. M, MP, right, MV equals PY or PQ. This is this relationship between money and how fast it goes through the economy, price levels, and the amount of stuff we make. Right? So price levels is P, Q would be real GDP. So multiply them together and you get nominal GDP. Nominal GDP is going to be proportionate to the amount of money and how fast that money goes around. And if one part of this equation changes, something's got to give to balance that out. So if, for example, we print a whole bunch of extra money, then it might be that that gets people to do more production. It might be that it results in higher prices, or it might be that there's no impact because at the same time there's a fall in velocity. But a famous Milton Friedman quote that's worth bearing in mind: inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's worth having. This is one of the rare cases where economics has like a good bumper sticker version of something, right? A nice, concise expression of a concept. Normally, our concepts are relatively complex and not easy to express in such a short, pithy statement. But it's important because it comes up all the time. You look at how people discuss issues, and they'll look at something like, say, increase in the minimum wage is going to contribute to inflation. Well, that's increasing the relative price of low-paid labor, but it's a relative price change. Something's got to give somewhere else in the market if there isn't also a monetary event going with that. So if we raise the minimum wage and that affects velocity, okay, that might result in, that might affect price levels. But if we aren't printing more money, we should be very skeptical of something like, increase in the price of steel contributing to inflation. More likely, it's some price increases and there's a fall in demand somewhere else in the market. So prices go up all the time, but prices also go down all the time. You look at something like computers, which have gotten dramatically cheaper, especially adjusted for inflation. When I was born, computers were something that cost tens of thousands of dollars and were not very good. Now, something that is, I've got a chip in my keyboard that is basically as powerful as a computer from the year when I was born. Uh, and that chip now costs tens of dollars instead of thousands of dollars. And of course, with inflation, it would have cost much, much more if we adjusted for inflation. So, price of computers has dropped dramatically. That has sort of had downward pressure on price levels, but at the same time, other prices have gone up, like the price of higher ed, the price of healthcare. So we always have prices going up and down. Looking at one price increasing is not evidence of inflation. We need to think about price levels overall. We need to think about the average, and that's only going to happen if we've got some change in this equation. So there was sort of a big perspective, a big view that it was Friedman versus Keynes. But another thing to bear in mind is that they're still fundamentally worried about the same type of recession. So a Keynesian recession is saying, hey, sometimes GDP slows down, sometimes economic activity slows down, not because there is some underlying physical cause like a drought or something that really is preventing us from being able to produce more. It's some sort of a miscoordination between the decision makers of buyers and the decision makers of producers. This mismatch between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So for Friedman, he looks at, say, the Great Depression as a Keynesian type recession where I'm not buying because you're not buying. It's still fundamentally the same type of recession. The big difference is that he sees the important policy lever as monetary policy rather than fiscal policy. And as we're seeing in the next chapter on public choice, there's a lot of public choice reasons to be very skeptical of fiscal policy. Those, lessons from public choice theory also apply to some extent to monetary policy. But in the last 40, 45 years, at least in the US and Europe, the central bankers have gotten pretty good at, not fully being insulated from political pressures, but being more insulated from political pressures than, say, Congress people who are determining fiscal policy. But still, right, the same type of recession. Now, we did see in this chapter the introduction of a supply side type recession. So when we look at the 70s, when Keynesian economics really takes a hit as we run into the period of stagflation, you have this Keynesian element of a fall in aggregate demand, but the supply side element is this slowdown caused by constrained aggregate supply, right? And this might be something that we worry about in the next 20, 30 years. The impact of government policy can have, can go either way, but the things that our government is doing and is likely to do in the next 20, 30 years, we might worry about how that impacts aggregate supply. And if that's shifting aggregate supply to the left, think about the models you saw in Principles of Macro or Intermediate Macro. If we're pulling aggregate supply to the left, we are shrinking the economy, not because I'm not buying because you're not buying, this feedback loop that Keynes was talking about, but simply because it is relatively more costly to supply, for example, because we have uncertainty about public policy, right? So if we expect that the next president is just going to be making deals with Carrier or whoever else to try and affect where economic activity goes on, that arbitrary way of doing public policy makes it riskier for someone looking to invest. So if you are a big company looking to invest $1 billion and the viability or the profitability of that plan depends on making a deal with the president, you're going to be less willing to do that. You're going to be less willing to invest in that. Those more arbitrary decision-making settings versus a more stable institutional framework is going to affect the supply side and potentially lead to economic slowdowns that aren't of the Keynesian type. Those sorts of recessions, printing more money isn't going to work. The Great Depression, Friedman pointed out, if they had printed a bunch of money when there were those bank runs that collapsed the money supply, we could have printed out of that recession. But trying to print out of a recession where the fundamental problem is on the supply side, it's not going to work. Now, there I'm thinking more public policy, but you look at, say, the COVID recession, that was definitely a supply side recession. It wasn't a problem of people aren't buying enough. It was a problem of we couldn't go to work, and so we just couldn't produce as much. So there are multiple types of recessions. I think I showed you guys last week on mru.org. If we look at principles of macroeconomics, we've got different theories of business cycles. So Keynes and the monitors are basically looking at the same type of recession. They just think that different mechanisms are important for causing that type of recession and for getting out of that type of recession. Okay, so Friedman, overall, it's a great chapter, pretty self-explanatory that monetary stuff is a little bit outside my wheelhouse. I'm not a monetary economist, so it's good to see that, but I would urge you, thinking about the most important economic lesson of this chapter, to think about this phrase, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomena. It's not a matter of some prices went up. It has to be something that's going to put most prices up and the average price level overall to go up. When one price goes up, some other price is going to go down, right? Unless we have a bunch more money supply chasing the same amount of goods. Now, little aside, I had an idea that I think might be useful for people looking to set up their final project, inspired by a recent episode of Conversations with Tyler. Tyler Cowen, very interesting economist, does great interviews. Recently put out a paper with his co-author Alex Tabarrok on using ChatGPT or using large language models such as ChatGPT for learning and teaching economics. And one illustration that he used for his podcast is to have ChatGPT or GPT-4 basically impersonate a historical figure. Now, it has to be someone who has a lot of writing, someone who has been written about a lot. So he goes with Jonathan Swift, not an economist, but someone for whom this exercise would work well. And so he basically gets GPT to act like Jonathan Swift, and with some effort is able to sort of invent this conversation, to invent this interview. So as a little example, it's kind of tough to see this. Let's see how far we can zoom in on this. So I gave some prompts to say, let's have you act like Adam Smith, and then explain the differences between your two famous books. What are the important differences? Just kind of prodding at it. And then it responds in not a perfect voice of Adam Smith, but it's giving you a starting point. It's giving you some material that you can then edit and turn into something that might be a compelling interview, right? It'd be great to see someone make a video presentation that isn't just a PowerPoint, but is sort of an interview between them and a historical economist. Now, that said, as I'm getting this, ChatGPT has sort of two big flaws. One is it's not really a very compelling writer. So if you're using ChatGPT, it's going to read like copy, right? It's going to read like advertising. It's not going to be, great. So you're going to have to do some editing. But that's how it goes, right? Good writing is good editing. You always write a crappy first draft, and then you fix it, and you keep working at it until you have something good. ChatGPT just gives you the crappy first draft right off the bat. Another thing, in this back and forth in particular, illustrates this, is he says he ChatGPT, the machine, says that Smith introduced the idea of the invisible hand in The Wealth of Nations, which isn't true. This is the other big flaw of ChatGPT, is it's often wrong. It's basically autocomplete, but way, way better. But autocomplete still does weird things. If you have your phone just pick the next word over and over and over again, sometimes it makes a funny sentence, sometimes it makes a reasonable sentence, sometimes it makes complete nonsense. ChatGPT makes complete nonsense less often, but it does get things wrong. So as I'm going through this, I see something wrong and I reply to it. Didn't you use the invisible hand metaphor in the theory of moral sentiments? And it says, oh, you're right, I did do that. So don't trust ChatGPT. It is not trustworthy. In 10, 15 years, the quality will be better, but right now it's making interesting stuff, but you have to be the human. You have to apply some wisdom. You have to oversee it because it's going to make mistakes. So read through it, you pick up the mistakes, and then you keep asking it questions. You keep pushing it, and you can get some interesting stuff out of it. So I would encourage you to take advantage of this, to try and get some back and forth, to try and have it explain your ideas. If you're writing a script for your presentation, you can put it into ChatGPT or other models and have it help with your editing. For example, in Notion, there is an AI element to it. So you can take a chunk of text and you can ask the AI to do something like change the tone, to make it more friendly, to make it more professional, to make it longer, to make it shorter. So this is another tool. You can use these large language models to improve your writing, to improve your presentation. Just don't trust them, right? Because it's a dumb machine, fundamentally. At the end of the day, it's garbage in, garbage out, and there's a lot of garbage that went into these models. So it is up to you to pick the garbage out of the result and turn it into something useful. If you're just copying and pasting, first off, you're going to be the first person to get automated out of your job. And second off, you're not going to get great results out of it. You're going to get mediocre results out of it. But that mediocre starting point can be a starting point for greatness if you put in the effort as the boss, as someone who's going to take, this output from a dumb machine and fact check, right? Make sure it's right, tweak it, edit it, improve the quality of the writing, right? It'll give you fodder, but it's up to you to make that fodder into something useful. So that might be a useful way for you guys as you're working on your final projects to improve those. I really like the idea of a format of this sort of an interview like Tyler Cowen did with ChatGPT impersonating Jonathan Swift. So if you want to have ChatGPT impersonate, say, Adam Smith or Vernon Smith or someone else, I think it'd be a really great way to beef up your presentation, make it a little bit more interesting than just the standard PowerPoint of here's some facts and now I'm done. All right, so that was not a ton of Milton Friedman. I think this was a nice, straightforward chapter, and I think being able to hear him on Econ Talk was good. We were able to hear him from his own voice, and he's a more recent author, so it's a little less foreign to us than, say, Adam Smith, right? Reading Adam Smith in his original English, it's 250-year-old English, so it just reads funny to us. It takes more effort. Friedman, a lot of important ideas, a lot of technical stuff that we can kind of breeze over a little bit in this class because we're more interested in the big picture, but I think it's a little bit more accessible also. I guess one last thing before I forget, one thing that impressed a lot of people, that had an impact on people, was this notion of, within this libertarian perspective, Friedman's argument that what we want from firms is for them to simply try to pursue profit. Now, Friedman would add a caveat to that. So at the beginning of the semester, we asked about Adam Smith and the notion that greed is good. And the important thing there is greed is a force that can be harnessed for good with the invisible hand, but the context has to be right. We have to have the rules of the game right. Greed is useful in a market setting. Greed is not good if we're looking at, say, a third world dictatorship. Greed in that context is going to make things much worse. For Friedman, pursuing profits is going to be good in an institutional framework where, for example, externalities are adequately dealt with, where we have a legal structure that doesn't encourage companies to push their costs off onto other people. If we have good institutions, then pursuing profit is a straightforward way to do a lot of good for society, with the added benefit that with markets we get valuable information about where we genuinely are doing the most good. So when we have the rules right, if you are making big profits, that means you're creating value to your consumers and you're using relatively less resources. You are facing lower costs. You're doing more net good. That's what profits signal to us, assuming we have the institutions right. Assuming we have the institutions right, if we then ask a company to do sort of the Whole Foods thing. I guess Whole Foods is pretty different post Amazon, but 10 years ago, Whole Foods was sort of the poster child of corporate responsibility. They were making money, but they were also doing this stuff for the environment. But were they really in a good position to do the most good for the environment? It's not clear, right? Maybe what would have been more effective is for them to make more profits and then to give those profits to some organization that's solely focused on some aspect of improving the world. Trying to do charity at the same time as trying to do markets is often a way to be worse at both. Or in the case of Whole Foods, it might be very good marketing and it might not be very effective at the social responsibility stuff we hope that they're doing. Really what it does is makes us feel less guilty as consumers, so we spend a lot of money without asking more questions. And I think that that's an important perspective to bring in when we think about what do we want people to do to make the world a better place. And I'll just close on this point. The libertarian perspective is one of multiple perspectives, and to have an effective society, we want to have multiple perspectives. Having a pluralistic approach is very, very valuable. But that's me kind of going into normative issues. I think that's a good place for us to end. As usual, if you got any questions, let me know in the usual places. For ChatGPT, one other thing to share is you can search for this, how to learn and teach economics with large language models, including GPT on SSRN. And this might give you some guidance for how you might use ChatGPT to make a better presentation. If you just copy paste, it's gonna make a bad presentation. But it can give a valuable starting point, and it can do fun things like impersonating historical figures, which could be useful for expanding your possible formats. All right, I will talk to you in the future. Adios.